Hi, I'm Dr. Janice Morrow. Thanks for joining us for another episode of American Mood Swings, where we talk about the brain and all things related to mental health. Welcome. All right, everyone. Well, thanks for joining us for another episode of American Mood Swings. I'm Dr. Janice Morrow, and my guest today is Dr. Xavier Amador, who has been working as a clinical psychologist for the last 30 plus years. He taught at Columbia University. He's written numerous books. He's worked in forensic psychiatry. And we're going to talk today about his extensive experience with psychosis and schizophrenia. And he's founded and the director of an institute called the Leap Institute. And they train first responders and family members how to better communicate with their loved ones that are afflicted with psychosis. And he wrote a wonderful book that I hope everybody reads. I'll probably bring this out somewhere. I'm a note taker. It's called I Am Not Sick, I Don't Need Help. And for any of us that have a family member or a loved one, we've probably all heard this numerous times. So we're going to talk about his book and the Leap Institute and all that. So we'll start, Dr. Amador, with you came over here as a refugee immigrant from escaping the Cuban Revolution, and you lost your father. So I think that that's very resilient, a story of resilience. I'd love to just let our viewers or listeners know a little bit about your background.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. And I have to laugh at your copy of my book because that looks like my copy where I have lots of post-its, things I want to edit and change for the next edition.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, no, it's really interesting. I was talking about being an immigrant just yesterday. We immigrated from Cuba on the heels of the revolution, and our father was killed in the revolution. And it was my mom and two brothers and a sister. And it was, I have to say I'm a very grateful immigrant. I'm a very fortunate immigrant because we arrived with nothing and we were able to uh, really thrive in this country and get educations and so on. My one brother did develop schizophrenia, which is one of the reasons I've gotten so involved over the last 35 years in not only research, but clinical work with people with schizophrenia, with doctors, with social workers, with first responders, law enforcement, family caregivers. We train everybody and anyone that has any contact, any engagement with people like my brother Henry, who suffered from schizophrenia. So that's just the short story of our immigration and my interest in this topic, my very deep, heartfelt interest in it.
Well, I was curious. I mean, it was a long time ago, but as an immigrant and losing your father, to me, that would be very traumatic. I didn't lose
Was
my father till just a couple of years ago in my 50s.
so,
So was there access to any kind of help or therapist as a young boy when you first arrived?
oh
Was
my goodness, no, we had trouble getting access to housing.
oh
we were I slept in a bed with my mother and my sister till I was 8 years old. Uh, no, it was really rough times. So there was absolutely no access to any kind of mental health care.
so it's a
Yeah.
different world now because I think there's a lot of programs now for
Oh
refugees.
yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Well, I have three children I adopted from Colombia, and all three have been in therapy. All three are grateful for their therapy experiences and are open about it. So I'm not, revealing any family secrets. So
Okay.
today it's real different, thankfully. Yeah.
Right. Well, let's talk about you founded the Henry Amador Center on the word is so hard to say. And
Anosognosia.
yes.
Anosognosia.
So let's
Anosognosia is a symptom of a lot of psychotic disorders that leaves people completely blind, unaware, cognitively blind, unable to see that they've got mental health issues or disorders. So everybody around them is saying you need help, something's not right, you're hearing voices, you have strange ideas, delusions. And the person with anosognosia, with this unawareness, is not in denial. It's another symptom, just like a hallucination or a delusion. And that's when we started the Leap Institute, actually long before Henry Amador Center.
oh,
The Leap Institute was founded back in 2000, so almost 25 years ago, to do research and, more importantly, to train and educate people about this symptom, because it changes the way we talk to someone. If we think they're in denial and being stubborn, we keep trying to educate. You've got an illness. Here's what it looks like. Here's what you need. You should be on medicine. And it drives the person away because the brain disorder has left them unable to see what the family and everybody around them sees, which is that they need help.
Yes, my brother used to, well, I haven't talked to him in a while, but he used to say, I'm not, I'm not
I'm
sick.
not sick.
It's everybody else, or it's just the stress of a divorce. You don't understand. You haven't been married. I haven't seen my son. This is just stress,
Yeah.
which definitely exacerbated his symptoms for sure. That's when he seemed to really, but, well, let's talk about LEAP and what it stands. I know that there's so much. We've only got a limited time, but what it stands for, the listening, empathizing, agreeing, and these things. Yeah, if you could.
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's 7 tools. 4 of them are in the acronym LEAP: listen, reflectively, actively, and I can explain a little bit more about what that means. That's the L. E stands for empathize in a very strategic way, and we normalize the person's feelings by saying things like, "Oh, the CIA we would reflect it back, is monitoring you, and it's driving you, out of your mind because you have no privacy and you're scared. Is that right? Did I understand it?" That's the reflective listening. Then the empathy part would be, I'd be frightened too if that was happening to me. I'm not agreeing with the person. I'm actively listening and expressing empathy for how they feel. The A stands for looking for areas where we can agree. We're not going to agree about the CIA. We're not going to agree about whether or not the person has mental illness because, the premise of our discussion is we're talking to somebody who clearly has mental illness, and we, clearly think that, and they absolutely are certain they do not. So we're not going to agree on that, but we can agree on all kinds of other things: staying out of the hospital, getting a job, work, many other things. And that's what we partner on. Now, that's the LEAP: listen, empathize, agree, partner. But there are 3 other tools that involve how we give our opinions about things like treatment, about whether or not the person has a mental illness. And that's delaying giving contrary opinions. So somebody asked me, do you think I have bipolar disorder or schizophrenia? I might say, I'm going to answer that question. Before I do, can you tell me more about what happened when the police came to your door because your family called them? Can we talk about that? Would that be okay? So we want to delay giving opinions that are going to be hurtful to the person if we can. And when the person wants to hear my opinion, I give it in a very specific way. We call it the 3 A's. We apologize for what we're about to say. We acknowledge our fallibility. We could be wrong, and we ask the person to agree to disagree. So if somebody asks me, they've got a delusion about an alien transmitter in the brain, somebody I'm thinking about I've worked with, and he asked me, well, do you agree with me? Do you think that I have it? Because it sounds like with all this reflective listening I was doing, he made the mistake of thinking I agreed with him. And I said, look, I'm sorry, and I could be wrong. I don't see it the same way as you do. And I just don't want to argue with you about it. I respect your point of view. I'm going to do that again because of the ding. So in giving the opinion, we want to apologize, acknowledge our fallibility, and ask the person not to argue. So if somebody, and there's somebody I talked to recently, asked me about the alien transmitter in his brain, and he asked me, well, do you believe it, Dr. Amador? I said, well, I want to apologize, and I could be wrong. It's not that I don't believe it. I just don't see it the same way you see it. I don't, since you've asked me, I don't see evidence that there is a transmitter in your brain. I don't want to argue with you. So we give our opinion in a very humble, soft way that gives room for me to communicate respect for the other person's point of view. You're not going to make delusions worse by doing these things, by giving our opinion in that way, by reflectively listening, actively listening. Delusions are fixed false beliefs. They're a manifestation of these brain disorders. So by not hitting that person over the head with our psychoeducation, with our opinion, we have a chance at developing a relationship that leads to treatment, a relationship that's really founded on respectful, non-judgmental communication that leads to trust and interest in our opinion. right? Because when my brother first became ill, I did what we all do. Hey, Henry, you're not well. You're sick. You're hearing voices. You've got these delusions that you killed our stepfather. Our stepfather had died of a heart attack, and Henry was sure he had killed him in this bizarre delusional way by playing the guitar. And I said, you're obviously not well and you need help. And he said, and I bet you've heard this, or if you haven't, I know millions of us have family members. He said, you're the crazy one, not me. I didn't call him crazy, but I said you needed help. And trying to educate him just drove him away from me, and educate him about his psychosis, his schizophrenia. It wasn't until years later that I developed this approach in collaboration with Aaron T. Beck, the father of cognitive psychology. And it's a real turnaround. You stop trying to educate and you start absorbing and listening to the person and respecting their point of view. Then my opinion starts to matter. Then I can suggest treatment, but not necessarily for an illness, for other things. So that's a big, quick summary of the LEAP approach.
Well,
And it's an evidence-based approach. It's been studied and double-blind, placebo-controlled, gold standard study. And it's very effective at first and foremost healing relationships, but then also helping people decide to accept treatment, even though they don't believe they have an illness. That's the real counterintuitive part of this approach. My brother was in treatment for 20 years almost. Never injections of antipsychotic medication once a month for 20 years, almost 18 years. And he never believed he had schizophrenia. When I asked him, why are you doing it? He said, I do it for you, for me. So it's the relationship that can lead to treatment.
But because he did that, he was able to live a normal life. It sounds like from your book and listening to
He
you.
was. Yeah. He had 2 volunteer jobs. He had a girlfriend. He was not going into the hospital every 3 months. He didn't have a hospitalization that entire time. He had one day hospitalization in 18 years that he was on medication. He passed away, sadly, in a car accident. But he passed away with us making a plan to come have him live near me. We were still very, very close our entire adult lives after I learned to talk to him differently.
Well, I hope I get, now that I've read your book and have watched several of your videos on YouTube from lectures you've done, I'm hoping sooner or later that my brother, I'm hoping that it's been a few years that he'll reach out and I can try some of these tools that I've learned in your book.
I hope so too.
Well, what would you say to people whose family members, like such as mine, like, is it better to leave them alone if they kind of cut off communication, or to keep trying? Because like I mentioned before we started, I will call and leave messages. I'll write little notes. And one doctor said, leave them alone. I'm a little scared that I'll trigger something. But then, every night before I hit the bed, I think about him and I'll want to leave a message, but I just haven't. Well, any thoughts on that?
I do. I mean, I have another book which is all about the LEAP method called "I'm Right, You're Wrong. Now What?" And in that book, there's a chapter called "Opening Closed Doors," and it's based on a lot of clinical experience with stories like yours. And sometimes leaving the person alone is the right thing to do, but not before we think about maybe what they're angry about and what they need an apology for. So many times it's an involuntary hospitalization that the family initiated, and they haven't talked to their loved one in 3 years, 5 years. They won't talk to them. And what I'll advise them to do is send a note or a voicemail and say, I've been thinking a lot about what happened, and I'm so sorry, and I wish I could change what happened, but I can't. I hope you'll forgive me. And that tends to be the first step towards opening that closed door. So there are things you can do. Leaving people alone after you've tried to humbly ask for forgiveness and apologize for things that were hurtful to them sometimes can be the right thing to do.
Yeah, I'm always thinking I don't want to trigger anything. If he's hasn't been in trouble and nothing's happened, there hasn't been an incident. But yeah, I guess at least I'm able to keep in touch with his son. So I'm hoping that one day they'll be reunified. So let's talk about we've got, oh, let's talk about a little bit about what schizophrenia is. I feel
Sure.
like I know you've been talking about this for 40 years, but there's so many people out there who don't. They really don't
Yeah.
understand. I know that my oldest brother, when my younger brother, the one who's sick, would have these delusions, and one of the hallmarks, I mean, he hears voices, constantly thinks people are trying to kill him and then
Mm.
poison him. And the other brother, not would say, he's just making all this up, he can stop this. And I'd say, no, I don't. So let's just talk about organically what's going on and some of the hallmark features of schizophrenia for people who don't know.
Well, I'll share that happened in my family. Our oldest brother thought my brother Henry was in control of these things, and he was just making it up and looking for attention. Would you say that to somebody with Parkinson's disease, where they have involuntary movements? No, you know that it's not under their control. So one of the things, the first thing I say is that schizophrenia is not intentional and it's not split personality. It's a neurodevelopmental brain disorder, just like Parkinson's. The person doesn't have the abnormal involuntary movements until later in life, or like Alzheimer's for that matter. Schizophrenia is the same. The person doesn't, and that's why it gets confusing for loved ones. The person, in all respects, is quote normal, and then in their late teens, early 20s, mid 20s, and sometimes later in life or earlier in life, but most people in their late teens and early 20s, uh, become different, very different. Withdrawal from relationships, withdrawal from school, from work, start maybe hearing voices, seeing things that aren't there, or having delusional, these very strange, implausible ideas, or their speech becomes disorganized. All of these are the consequence of what is essentially chemical chaos in the brain. I mean, we could go into detail all the different brain regions involved, but we do know that the brain looks abnormal. There are differences in the brains of people with schizophrenia compared to the rest of the population, and it functions very differently in terms of the neurotransmitters that are utilized and that are, to put it sort of simply, out of balance. And that's what the medications are for, is to essentially calm the chemical chaos and and put the neurotransmitters back in balance. There's other treatments besides medicine, cognitive behavioral therapy for psychosis, which is a wonderful new innovation, relatively new, last 20 years.
Yeah, let's talk
Um,
about that. How, for
sure.
someone who's never heard of it.
Well, basically, CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, has been around for 50 years and it's fantastic for depression and anxiety. And then about 25 years ago, a lot of my colleagues got interested in, can we use this to help people with schizophrenia who, for example, have hallucinations or delusions? And it actually works. It's really surprisingly well, especially with hallucinations, but also with delusions. And with delusions, what it helps is for the person to question the belief a little bit, and more important, not have the beliefs drive their behavior. So if you have delusions that are paranoid and you've closed the blinds and you've closed yourself off from everybody around you, with the CBTP, cognitive behavioral therapy for psychosis therapist, you help the person to not respond to the delusion so much, so they can live, a more productive life, not an isolated life. And there's been a lot of research on it. Uh, Most of us in the field believe that medication with the cognitive behavioral therapy for psychosis is a better approach than just one or the other.
Mm. Um, I know it feels like it with my brother and the interactions, like everything well, it was because before I knew people like you, but it feels like everything I did was exactly like what you're not supposed to do. He'd say there's someone in the next room trying to kill me, and I'd take him to the next room and say, look, nobody.
Show them that there isn't, right? Yeah.
No, no, no,
Guilty as charged. I did the same thing. Well, since you read my book, for 7 years, I did that. And every time I tried to show him reality, we call it reality testing, right? Right. Every time I did reality testing with him, it backfired on me. It just made him angry and feeling alone and misunderstood.
Mhm.
So that's the hardest part for people learning the LEAP approach, is to refrain from explaining. refrain from logic, refrain from trying to convince the person that the things they believe are happening or they're seeing or hearing aren't real. It really pushes that person away from us.
You've probably heard, I don't know about New York where you are. So in California, there was something that just passed in the last election called, it
The
started,
CARES Court.
yeah.
Oh,
So,
very familiar with it and very excited for Californians. Yeah.
well, yeah, I would love to hear your thoughts, and I'll just mention this to viewers because I've talked to people on both sides. When it initially passed, I was having a brother with severe schizophrenia, and I was very happy because there was a particular incident, like he had never been violent, never been arrested, and there was a night he heard voices. This was about 10 years ago, but he shot at a wall. It was like 2 in the morning, and thank God it was a cinder block wall, so nobody was hurt, but he could have killed people, and they could have charged, they were planning to charge him with 2 felonies. So here's this person who's never even been arrested for anything. He could have gone to prison the rest of his life. The judge was merciful, said, recognized he compelled him into get mental help. And my mom had to pay for a lawyer. That's the only reason he did that. But it was so scary. So when CARES Court passed, I thought, oh, thank God, somebody like my brother. But then immediately, like every civil rights group in the state was all over that, protested it, and I spoke with them because I wanted to hear both
Good.
perspectives. But it
Yeah, we should.
definitely, but the doctors like you and people in the field feel that this is a very good thing. So let's talk about what you know and why the pros of CARES courts.
Well, how it's implemented is going to be really important. And actually, we've had contact with the courts, and there's a lot of interest in using the LEAP approach. Um, the you know, and I've just actually been very engaged in my forensic work with the ACLU. So I love what they do. I admire what they do. Civil libertarians, however, when it comes to mental illness, seem to be losing the forest for the trees. If somebody had dementia and wandered out into the street, what do? A silver alert, right? They disappear. We understand their brain disorder is endangering them. Now, somebody with schizophrenia or even bipolar disorder doesn't appear like somebody with dementia, but they're exactly the same in that they have this neurodevelopmental brain disorder that affects their judgment. Look what happened with your brother. There was no judgment there because he had a different reality than the rest of us. So he fired his firearm at the wall. So what I do with my friends and colleagues who are civil libertarians is try to help them understand that they're not protecting an individual's rights when they try to get their quote freedom from treatment. What they're doing is protecting the brain disorder's right to continue to be psychotic. So that's one thing I try to help them understand. And I understand it's always going to be controversial, and we do have to be cautious. But involuntary intervention, has been around for a long time. And I've seen it save lives. I've seen it transform lives for the positive. So I also think that involuntary treatment is a intervention of last resort, but it's an important thing we need in our tool belt to be able to save the lives and help people recover their lives.
Well, one doctor I spoke with out here, he brought that up too, and he said, look, there's going to be some people that just don't respond to medicine. A certain percentage will need to be, taken care of, basically 24-hour, and that. So he really was advocating for more. I was asking him, like, if there's all this money, like if we got $1 billion tomorrow designated for mental health, what are its best uses? Because that's a mixed bag. People say different things, and he said long-term beds, for sure. He, at least here in Los Angeles, that we need. And you mentioned it in your book, I think, that, or one of the lectures, how like in the 70s and the 80s there was something like 500,000 beds, and now
That's right.
it's almost like a fifth of that. So where'd all the, if you want to touch on that.
Well, I do, because the numbers we had 500,000 beds in the 70s, and that number went way down in the tens of thousands. And on the other side, we had tens of thousands of mentally ill people in our jails and prisons, and that's gone up to over 500,000. So the numbers went like this. Where are people ending up? They're ending up in our criminal justice system. if not for your mother, if not for her resources, from
Oh,
what the story you just told me, your brother would be in prison. And that's not where he belongs. He's, from what you told me before we started this interview, he's living a life and he's not harming anyone. Uh, it's a really, and what we do at Leap Institute is we train judges. We've trained hundreds of judges and district attorneys and defense attorneys to better understand how to engage people in treatment. And it's trial or treatment is sometimes the choice. And with the CARES courts, that's going to be an element of it. Um, treatment in most cases is the right option, because we're not talking about people with long history of antisocial criminal behavior. We're talking about people who have delusions or hallucinations that cause them in a singular moment to act in a way that's illegal. And uh, clearly they need treatment. Clearly they need supports, and not to be in prison.
something that you mentioned in your book that I think is really important that people know, because I when my brother had a flare up I was at a hotel in Hawaii, so he came to visit me, and I heard him out on the balcony talking to himself, and eventually by the time I looked out, he was like on the edge of this hotel, like a tightrope, and I thought he was going to for sure die. That I just went in the bathroom, called the police. I didn't know what to do. I called the police. Didn't want to watch what I thought was going to happen. And they got there. They couldn't have been nicer, and they were able to get him down, and he was in a hospital, and within like a week, like almost sounding like his normal self. But you mentioned in the book, so that when people do call the police, that you can ask for if they have crisis intervention, because we've all seen some very high profile situations when somebody calls the police on their loved one. They just don't know what to do when the police come, and they're so startled, and it happens so quickly, and this person gets shot. So let's hear your
Yeah.
thoughts on that.
Uh, People with untreated mental illness do get hurt and killed by law enforcement. It's a tragedy that can be and often is now being avoided because law enforcement more and more is getting trained in crisis intervention. They're being trained by mental health professionals like myself and colleagues, other police officers who have that training. It's called CIT, Crisis Intervention Teams. And we're very fortunate today. It is not everywhere, but it's in most places in the States now. We train them as well at the Leap Institute, and there are other training programs. Well, we've trained thousands of officers. And what they learn first and foremost is to recognize if they're dealing with somebody, encountering somebody with a mental illness who's actively having a psychotic episode. And then they learn, rather than, what they learn in the academy is command and control, pull your weapon and tell the person to comply with the directions. But what the CIT officers learn is to put their hands up and say, tell me what's going on. Talk to me, and de-escalate the person. And typically the tool they use instead of a weapon is reflective active listening. Tell me what's going on. And then they hear the delusion, they hear about the hallucinations, and they actively reflect it back. Oh, so your problem is that God is speaking to you and telling you to jump off the balcony, let's say, so that you can rise from the dead in 3 days. I've worked with somebody similar story. Is that what God is saying to you? Yeah. Tell me more about that. And they engage the person and talk them down and help them come with them peacefully, not tase them or worse. And I've worked with just incredibly wonderful people who are in law enforcement who care deeply, as you and I do, about helping people with these brain disorders, and getting them the help they need. So I'm very optimistic about what can happen, what's happening more often in law enforcement. We still have more work to do.
One of my guests a few months back, he is a retired police officer from Houston, and he has a training program as well, because
Right.
and I didn't realize how small most police departments are, and most of them don't require. And
No, they don't. They don't.
and that would be on a national level, that would be a great thing to implement, right? And so when you're
Well, and Janice, let me just say one more thing. to emphasize for people who are listening to our conversation, if you do need to call the police, just always ask. I'm just going to amplify what you said when you asked me the question. Just always ask, do you have a CIT unit? Do you have CIT officers? That's who we'd like to have respond to our call. If you're calling about a loved one in crisis, ask for CIT or for a crisis team.
Yeah, I definitely, I didn't know about that. When my brother, that incident at the hotel, that was probably 7 or 8 years ago. But what was scary too, and I'd love to hear your thoughts because it forever changed me. I'm about 5'2", 125 pounds. My brother's about 6'2". So when I saw him, he was talking to himself for a few hours on the balcony. I had been trying to get him to go but eventually when I saw him start to go over the balcony, I went to grab him and try to pull him over, and I almost went over the balcony with him. For sure, probably the scariest moment of my life. And I thought, okay, that's never going to happen again. Like you have to not go over the cliff with it. Have you seen people in similar situations?
Oh, many times. And the stories always hinge on one moment. Don't lay hands on the person if they're agitated and doing something dangerous, because it usually escalates. Instead, put your hands up and say, please tell me what's going on, talk to me, and then actively listen and try and engage the person in telling you what's going through their mind so you can start to be respectful of that, but then ask them to come off the balcony. Let's talk some more. You know, once the person feels heard, look, we all want to feel heard. We all want to feel understood. And when somebody is in a psychotic episode, they're some of the loneliest people I've ever met because everybody around them is telling them their reality is false. So when we can engage with their reality and find a way to communicate with them where they feel heard, understood, they're metaphorically and literally more likely to come off that balcony and talk with you. And that's probably what the officers you called did, who handled it so well. They probably engaged him in a conversation.
I can't. I thank God in my prayers every night that whatever they did, because I thought he was going over for sure. I thought that was the end of his life that night. And maybe they had been trained. I'll never know. It was so long.
You know, some people in my brother's first psychotic episode was long before we had CIT. It was 1981. And I met the officers out front. I called him for an involuntary hospitalization because he was suicidal. And this is before CIT. And I said, look, he doesn't have a weapon. He has no criminal history. He's not threatening anybody. He's suicidal. They were wonderful. What's my point? So many people in law enforcement do it because they have a heart. They want to serve. They want to protect. They want to help. So even if you don't get CIT, you will run across people who just sort of intuitively have the tools. But sometimes you don't. And that's when tragedy occurs.
But when police see a weapon, hopefully, in a schizophrenic state, they could be talked into putting it down. But often the first response is it's just fear and the adrenaline. So let's kind of pivot because there was just something released yesterday. So marijuana's become I'm personally happy that it's not going to be that they want to declassify it so it's not in the same category as heroin. But I still don't think it's great for the brain. And there was something that was just released yesterday, some kind of research that more people are using that than alcohol.
10 million more are using THC than are drinking. Yeah, I know the research. Yeah.
So I'd love your thoughts because I think because of the popularization and the legalization, that a lot of people are under the impression, well, it's really harmless for your brain. It's not. So I'd just love to hear your thoughts on that.
There's been a lot of research on the use of marijuana and its impact on the brain for many, many decades. But in the last 20 years, and it seems to be benign for the most part, except in the developing brain. So when you're talking about teens, adolescents, pre-adolescents, and very early adulthood, the evidence is more and more clear that it can trigger the onset of schizophrenia. It increases your chances almost 11-fold of developing schizophrenia. My brother was a big pot smoker in his teens and early 20s. I have to wonder now, in retrospect, years later, having read this research, if that's what triggered his schizophrenia. So marijuana in young people is not benign. You do run a risk of developing a major life-altering psychotic illness.
Well, I feel the same about my brother because we don't have any family history, but he moved to Hawaii at 17, and I think they
Uh-huh.
call it pakalolo, and it's a lot. It's strong. You always hear, Maui Wowie, but he's probably
Yeah.
smoking every day for 35 years. So I wonder too, as his sister, like, could that have been what triggered all of this? But you know,
Well, the brain is developing until we're 25 years old. Our frontal lobes are not developed until we hit about 25 years of age. So introducing marijuana in that developing brain, it clearly is having an impact on the development of the brain and producing a much greater risk for schizophrenia.
um, let's talk about. There is a perception too. We have a lot of mass shootings in this country, and a lot of people. I know it's the gun people, gun rights, to more guns. It's not the guns, it's the people, and so a lot of people think that all of these mass shootings, that people are more prone to be violent, and the research says otherwise. With your experience, if you want to touch on that, the perception of somebody with schizophrenia being violent.
Love to touch on that. I'm glad you asked the question because I really want us to end on a hopeful note when we do end this discussion. People with schizophrenia, the research is abundantly clear, are no more violent than the general population. That said, so they're not more violent. That said, when not in treatment, there is an increased risk of violence. And it really makes sense. If you've got delusions that lead you to want to protect yourself or protect your loved ones, you may act in an aggressive, violent way. And there's other ways, other pathways to that kind of behavior. So helping people to be in treatment is critically important to avoid all kinds of negative outcomes, including aggression and violence. But even then, the majority of people, overwhelmingly, even not in treatment, are not violent. But there is an increased risk if not in treatment.
Not taking their meds. I know at one point when they put my brother in a hospital, and I remember asking the lawyer, well, he hasn't done anything. He wasn't arrested. I don't understand. He said, well, if you need to stay out of this and let him get the help he needs. That was very humbling. And he was right. And but he said if they are perceived to be violent, they could be with themselves or others. So and then yeah, just recently someone, a neighbor, so they're not these mass shootings are not necessarily. I've always felt that it's just somebody. It could just be anybody, not necessarily they're mentally ill. They're just mad. They're mad at the world, mad at a person, just pure
Oh,
rage.
the research on mass shootings is that the majority of people who are engaged in those horrific crimes do not have schizophrenia or psychotic disorders. It's a minority. Does it happen? It has happened. A case that I worked on, Jared Loeffner, out of Tucson, Arizona, who shot Congresswoman Gabby Gifford and shot and killed 6 people, including a 9-year-old girl and a federal judge. That was untreated schizophrenia. That was based on delusions that he had. He had never been violent before or since his case settled.
Just one incident, he was violent.
Yeah, yeah.
I think she lived. Yeah, let's
He
kind
did.
of go. You mentioned in your book that yeah, you do. I don't know if you're still working in forensic psychiatry, but you have an extensive background. You've worked on many high profile criminal cases. So what is it that a forensic psychiatrist does, and what are you doing when you're on these like the Unabombers, just one of many that you've worked on, and you just mentioned this. What is it that they bring you, and what does a forensic psychiatrist do, and what is your role once you're involved?
Well, our role, and let me just be clear, it's a very part-time job. It's
Oh,
not, it's
okay.
not something that I have built my career on. It's not something I ever sought out. And in fact, my first case was the so-called Unabomber case, Theodore Kaczynski. I didn't even know you could charge for your time working on a case. I didn't never sent them a bill. So it's not my career path. I now charge because it takes a lot of my time. I've worked on over 90 death penalty cases involving people with schizophrenia and related disorders, always for the defense, only because I've never been asked by the prosecution, which is fascinating to me. I do have pretty solid national reputation as a reliable, reputable expert in courts. Court judges have appointed me. Defense attorneys have asked for my help, but never prosecutors, which has been interesting, even though I train prosecutors in our LEAP program. But what do we do? I can sum it up in one sentence. I become a biographer. I tell the life story of this person and how the illness, the schizophrenia, derailed their life and its relationship to the crime that they committed, the crime they've been accused of committing. So it's actually really meaningful work because I not only talk to the person who's been charged, awaiting trial, but I also talk with their family members. I talk with their spiritual advisors. I talk with childhood friends, and I really get to understand who they are, before and since the onset of their illness. And I'm able to, like a medical examiner, after death can determine the cause of death. Well, after a violent crime, as a forensic psychologist, I can determine the intersection between the mental illness and the personality of the person and how that led to the crime. It's very meaningful work. It's something I probably will always do. I just came back from New York City working on 2 cases. I usually have only about 2 to 4 cases a year, but the cases go on for years. So it's, some of them, one case has gone on for, out of Hawaii, actually, ironically, went on for 10 years. Multiple homicide case of a young man with schizophrenia. So it's been, it was birthed by fire with Ted Kaczynski's case, the Unabomber. And the way I got into that case might be interesting to you and those, listening to our discussion. I was reading in the New York Times how Ted was in denial and not accepting his attorney's attempt to present to the court and the jury his mental illness, his schizophrenia. And I just contacted both sides, the prosecution and the defense, and said, hey, I was an academic at Columbia University doing research on this problem, identifying that this is a symptom of the brain disorder, that quote, denial. I said, are you familiar with anosognosia, the symptom? And nobody was, and the defense immediately asked me to help them explain to the court, explain to the judge that that's what their client was suffering from. So it was a real birth by fire, a very high profile case that really was driven by me being a clinical researcher, an academic, frustrated that the people in the criminal justice system working on this case didn't have a clue about the science, that he was trying to fire his attorneys because they wanted to present mental health evidence, not because he was stubborn or in denial or arrogant, because he had anosognosia, another symptom. It's almost like a delusion that nothing was wrong with him.
What was the outcome of that? Did he get life in prison or?
Life in prison without parole. Sadly, he passed away a few years ago. I ended up befriending his brother, David, the one who turned him in. And
that must have been a hard thing to live with. I mean,
it was, I mean, I don't want to speak for David, but he knows he did the right thing, but it was a very hard thing to live with. But the case resolved because the government, once the court and the government, the prosecution heard about anosognosia and Kaczynski did not want his lawyers to present mental health evidence, everybody agreed to settle the case before trial. And he pled to life in prison without parole. He was facing the death penalty. So from his defense attorney's perspective, it was a win. They saved his life.
So generally, if someone is found to be sick rather than a history and like what you just mentioned, not realizing that, are they generally spared the death penalty? Is that part of the goal?
No, absolutely not. We execute people actively psychotic with schizophrenia. It's horrific. It's a tragedy. I've said goodbye to 2 people with schizophrenia who I had been evaluating, and one just 2 days later was executed. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. And there's a myth in the public. Oh, you're trying to get the person off. No. In these cases, we're typically trying to educate the jury about the nature of the mental illness so that they have compassion and spare the person's life. Let's put them in prison, preferably a forensic prison hospital, for the rest of their lives and keep the public safe from them. But because they understand it was a brain disorder that led to the crime.
Okay. I'd love to we're kind of nearing at the end of our time. I'd love just to, you mentioned in your book, most people have let's talk about the prognosis. Because I remember when I'd asked one of my good friends, when my brother was first diagnosed, I said, do you think, is he going to get better? He's like, no, Janice, he's going to get much worse. But
Yeah.
if he takes medicine. But I'd love for people out there, it's very painful watching your loved one self-destruct, or I like the way how you said their life was derailed. That's what I think happened to my brother. The life he planned, it just got derailed with this sickness. But the prognosis and the hope, and like you mentioned, your brother living a normal life. And then I think I read that well, you just mentioned earlier that you had adopted 3. I know in the book I saw that you had adopted one son and he developed some symptoms of, but then he was been on medicine and living a normal life. So let's talk about the hope and the prognosis for these people.
Well, when my brother first got ill, this is in the early 1980s, I was told, and the prevailing wisdom back then was, this is a deteriorating course. He's going to get worse. Nothing could be further from the truth. People actually tend to get a little bit better post 50 years of age, a little bit better all on their own. But with medication, with treatment, and also therapy, but especially medication, overwhelming majority of people, over 80%, improve and do really well. And that 20% that don't respond to medication can respond to other interventions like psychosocial supports and cognitive therapy, like I was discussing earlier. So there's a lot of reason to have hope. Now, there's a caveat. About 50% of people have this symptom of anosognosia. So they're avoiding treatment actively because they don't need it from their perspective. So that's my life's work, is how do we engage people in treatment? That 50%. Schizophrenia alone, 1.5 million Americans with schizophrenia in this country are not in treatment because they have anosognosia, because they do not understand they have mental illness. Their families are estranged, they've lost friendships, and they're at risk for ending up in our criminal justice system, ending up on the streets homeless, unemployed, and worse. So, my life's work is about engaging, reaching out to that person, building a relationship with them, and helping them decide to accept treatment, just like I was able to do with my brother Henry. And it's been just immensely meaningful work for me, working with families, working with mental health professionals, working with police officers and judges and attorneys, and giving them the tools to engage people in treatment. That 50%, that 1.5 million Americans with schizophrenia who do not understand they're ill, we can't leave them behind. People like your brother David, like my brother Henry.
Do you, for as far as the training, do people come to a physical location, or is this done online? And I'm curious, you mentioned you're going to be moving. Are you retiring? Are you still going to be involved in the
No,
league?
I'm never gonna retire.
Okay.
No, Leap Institute is leapinstitute.org if people are interested. And I mentioned it not to sell anything, because we have a resources section with free videos. There's about a dozen free videos that teach Leap.
Nice.
So leapinstitute, one word.org. And we do a lot of virtual trainings. Myself and our faculty go places. We've been all over the country this year alone. We've been overseas training in over 22 countries. We've been training the LEAP approach. So there's opportunities out there to learn about how to do this, and to learn about anosognosia, and to pick up some of the skills for free just by going to the website.
All right.
Yeah.
And when I edit this, I'll make sure, and that's all included.
Okay.
Anything you'd like to part with that I might not have asked, or anything else?
The thing I'd like to end with is, I have seen so many success stories involving people with anosognosia who are certain nothing is wrong with them, their family is in conflict with them, and I've seen people recover and accept help. Have hope. I have hope that's based on experience. We can help people who don't understand they have illness.
Right. Well, it's a very beautiful message. And again, everybody, well, there's several books, but this one is the first one I've read. I Am Not Sick. I Don't Need Help. You can order it on Amazon. And it's very informative, and it kind of goes over the LEAP method and how to better communicate with your loved ones. So,
And it's on Audible and ebook as well. So ebook is the cheapest.
okay.
Like
Well,
nine. But I'd love to meet you, and I'm so grateful. And the reason I say yes to podcasts like yours, we do a little research, is I think you're really making a difference. So
thank you.
keep doing it. Kudos. Keep doing it.
Thank you so much. Well, I'm learning a lot, and it's so I just can't wait to. I hope the whole world, hears about these organizations, the nonprofits, and this. And I know I felt very lost and scared when my brother was first. I had not been around anyone with schizophrenia. I would just Google things, listen to people, and it's talking to the experts has been very helpful. And we'll have a nice Memorial weekend. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thanks so
bye-bye.
much.
Okay, bye
Take
bye.
care, Janice. Bye.
Thanks, everybody, for joining us for another episode of American Mood Swings, where we talk about the brain and all things mental health. Hope to see you next week, and please share with your friends.